You're right.
And you told me you needed something. Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Jason Pushkar. I'm the Associate Dean for the Humanities here at UWM. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is really the kickoff of a day and a half of events related to generosity and the future of academic publishing and other kinds of publishing as well. So just a few words to start us off. And first, a few thanks. Thanks to UWM Libraries for putting this on. Thanks also to the Center for 21st Century Studies and to the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. All of their support crucial for this. Very, very special thanks to Nicole Welk-Yeager, who pulled together this incredible group of speakers and who was really one of the guiding lights of this whole enterprise. So thank you, Nicole. We're all hoping this event will inspire more discussion at UWM for a long time to come, including for the next day and a half, as we think about how to reimagine the role of the humanities in both public and academic discourse, and especially in relation to publishing. So I just want to say, by way of getting us started, a few words on behalf of generosity, because I'm so impressed by Professor Fitzpatrick's book, and so pleased that she's elevated this term to this value and term to new prominence in our field. I got my PhD in 2004, when I think the only way, where I was anyway, that people could unite around the theme of generosity would have been in opposition to it. We conceived of the academic enterprise as something like a heroic ideal, or a heroic ordeal, I should say, in which suffering was required. And if you weren't suffering, you probably weren't doing it right. And of course, since you had to suffer, you probably had to find ways to make sure others were suffering along with you. And I think we all got way too good at that. The early pages of Generous Thinking, talking about critique, felt like a tour of my own early doctoral education. I had many, many very, very generous teachers. But generosity kind of registered as a sort of mental feebleness, or maybe at best an irrelevance. It was kind of like dressing well or having good table manners. It was nice. You should do it. But it wasn't really why we were here, right? And it didn't seem to really matter. Well, I wish I had Professor Fitzpatrick's book when I started, but probably not as my early students would wish I had had her book, because I'm embarrassed when I reflect at how I brought that heroic ordeal mentality into my own classroom, teaching, even research, way too much. But I want to share my own conversion experience, how that happened and what it led to, because I think nothing has been more important for me as an academic, and it really has convinced me of the value of this great book. So about 10 years ago, I did something that completely changed how I teach. It completely changed how I read, how I work with colleagues. It's transformed me as a doctoral advisor, as a grader, almost everything. And that thing did not happen in the academy. It happened over in Lake Park, coaching 9-year-old children's soccer. And if you have ever coached 9-year-old children's soccer, as I now have for almost a decade, you know that it is a kind of ordeal of its own, but a good one. But you learn very quickly that some of the things that work in that kind of teaching, because after all, coaching is just a kind of teaching, criticism doesn't work, hectoring doesn't work, correction doesn't work. Turn down the emotional temperature too far, we'll go find warmth elsewhere, right? It just doesn't happen. But what works is positivity and patience, and a word, generosity, right? And that teaching makes the kids love it. It made me love it, but I had to learn it. And once I saw it in effect with 9-year-olds, I knew it was what my doctoral students needed too, and I knew it was what I needed as well. And I've been a much happier academic and a much more generous academic, I think, ever since. So I say that just very briefly here, because now as a university administrator, I'm so convinced that what Professor Fitzpatrick says is really just crucial for the next stage of all of our universities. I I don't think of generosity as some special moral imperative that we need to practice. I think generosity is what works. It's what makes us better. It's what makes our universities better. It makes our research better. It makes our students, our teaching. It makes everything better. As a university, we may not always be as generous as 9-year-olds on the soccer field, but I'm convinced we should try. It is such a pleasure to have Kathleen Fitzpatrick here today to talk about generosity. And to introduce her, please let me turn things over to Michael Doyle, Associate Vice Provost and Director of the UWM Libraries. Michael.
Thank you, Associate Dean Pushkar. Just a bit of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded. And for our virtual attendees, we're monitoring the Q&A. That sounds kind of ominous to say it like that. And we will share your questions at the end of the talk. I'd just like to make some opening remarks too. One of the deepest and longest traditions surrounding the University of Wisconsin system is something we call the Wisconsin idea. And this conveys the belief that public education should extend beyond the lecture hall, the classroom, and the research labs, and ultimately impact the entire state and touch all the citizens of the state. Despite all the headwinds confronting public higher education in this state, and please let's not make a list at this moment, the Wisconsin idea remains a really powerful touchstone for many of us who work in the state and across these UW institutions. It reminds us why we're here and keeps us engaged with and committed to the ideas of public education as a common good. The Wisconsin idea, I think, resonates with the notion of generosity that Dr. Fitzpatrick articulates so well in her recent book, and it can be a strong foundation for recentering the idea of public education as a common good. But I think that more will be needed. As Dr. Fitzpatrick's work demonstrates, there are numerous ways in which public universities, even ones as great as ours, with their emphasis on prestige and centering of competition over collaboration, we get in our own way all the freaking time, stumble in our own efforts to realize our nobler ambitions. So to learn more about all this, it's my privilege to welcome our speaker to make a few introductory remarks about her. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is Professor of English and Director of Digital Humanities at Michigan State University. Among her many accomplishments, Dr. Fitzpatrick co-founded the digital scholarly network Media Commons, which is an important early space for early experiments with open peer review and humanities publishing. She is currently the project director of Humanities Commons, an open access network that supports scholars and practitioners in the humanities. She's the author of several books, including Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology and the Future of the Academy, published in 2011, and most recently, Generous Thinking, a Radical Approach to Saving the University, published in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm really delighted and particularly delighted to be part of a conversation that's going to extend into tomorrow and thinking about humanities publishing and its futures. I'm really glad in particular to get to be here with you in person. Folks on Zoom, I'm glad you're here listening to us, but Zoom has made it possible for us to continue to work together, right? Despite the distance that's been involved over the last several years, which is wonderful. I mean, this is one of the many things that we have learned from the pandemic, that we can do a lot of things remotely that we thought we had to travel for, and that can include many more people when those remote possibilities are available. But we've also learned that there are things that genuinely benefit from being and working together. There have been a lot of these kinds of lessons in all of our lives over the last several years. Some of them have been positive and some of them have been much less so. But all of them, I hope, will be able to carry with us in this return to campus, right? As we're back together, thinking and thinking about how to move our campuses forward. And I want to carry these lessons of the pandemic with us, not least because returning to normal, right, or seeking some kind of new normal post-pandemic, it feels like it has been a costly mistake that we've seen made on a lot of campuses. I mean, we have an opportunity to avoid normal, to build something better and something particularly that's more fluid and more capable of growth in our institutions. But coming back better, building that better is going to require us to think pretty differently, I think, about the structures within which we work in the academy and about how to change them in order to support the kind of institution that we genuinely want to be part of. So that's my focus for this afternoon. But before I move on, I do want to provide a little warning that my next slide, and only my next slide, has a little bit of language in it. And that warning is mostly meant for folks, I mean, like, y'all are all okay, right? But the folks at home, if you have little ones running around behind you, this might be a good moment to distract them. Okay, so back in 2020, just before everything began shutting down, sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom posted a thread on Twitter in which she talked about the things that she tells early career Black scholars who seek her advice on surviving in the academy. And these two tweets in particular caught my attention. This place was fucked up when you got here. It will be fucked up when you leave here. All you can control is how much you let it fuck you up in the process, right? And that's a pretty impolitic stance, she says, but I stand by it. I don't think these institutions can support us or love us, and I honor the many, many people who work to make them more humane, but you alone cannot do that, and you cannot do it ever by killing yourself. Now, we've seen all kinds of evidence over the last several years of the horrifying accuracy of that perspective, right? That no matter how much we might love and support them, our institutions do not and cannot love us in return. These institutions have long been dedicated first and foremost to their own survival. And we've seen that priority play out in a wide range of decisions that privilege the security of the institution over the well-being of the people that it comprises. And I include in this category choice to prioritize the flow of tuition dollars during the pandemic over the safety of students and staff by returning too hastily to in-person instruction, the choice to prioritize institutional reputation over individual safety and dignity by suppressing, ignoring, and dismissing complaints of sexual harassment and assault, as we've seen around the nation, the choice to respond to calls for racial justice with superficial statements and underfunded add-on measures, and the choice to deploy an increasingly militarized police presence in response to civil protest, right? All of these choices share the conviction that the institution and its ways of being are far more important to the people for whom it exists. And all of them have led me to ask what would be required for us to remake the university as an institution that is structurally capable of living out its duty of care for all of its members, rather than seeking in a moment of crisis to minimize its obligations and ensure that all of its relationships remain forever contingent. Now, the one thing that it would require is collective action, right? Because McMillan Cottom is right. You alone, individually, cannot change things. Together, we might. But first, we have to build that together, right? And build the spaces and the places of supporting the idea of togetherness. Find ways to ensure that our commitment to together supersedes and outlasts the pressures that we experience as individuals. Now, as you might guess, much of what I'm talking about today grows out of some of the arguments I made in Generous Thinking, a radical approach to saving the university. Now, the Saving the University part of the book's subtitle had to do with my growing conviction that the survival of institutions of higher education in the United States, and in particular public institutions of higher education, is going to require those of us who work on campus to change our approach to the work that we do within them and the ways that we use that work to connect to the many publics that our institution serves. Now, the radical approach part of the subtitle came from my increasing sense that the necessary change involved is a huge one, and that it can't be made incrementally, right? Rather, it requires, as Chris Newfield notes in the conclusion of his amazing book, The Great Mistake, a paradigm shift, because there is no easy path or simple tool that can take us really from where we are today to where we need to be. As Tressie McMillan-Cotta, again, has noted the crisis in higher education today, this is not a problem for technological innovation or a market product. This requires politics. I mean, the problem, after all, begins with politics. And, Wisconsin, more than many, has experienced those politics head on. The American university that not too long ago served as a highly accessible engine of social mobility, making a rich liberal arts-based education broadly available, has been undone. And we are facing today not just the drastic reduction in that institution's affordability, but an increasing threat to its very public orientation, as rampant privatization not only shifts the burden of paying for higher education from the state to individual students and families, but also turns the purpose of our institutions from the creation of a shared social good that was the Wisconsin ideal and happily continues in many forms, right? That broadly educated population ready to participate in building a better world, to instead the production of market-oriented individual benefit in the form of a credential. Right. Moreover, as early as 2018, Inside Higher Education was reporting on what they called a larger than typical decline in confidence in an American institution in a relatively short time period. And this falling confidence, which in turn, has turned in the ensuing years into outright antagonism, can't simply be dismissed as evidence of an increasingly entrenched anti-intellectualism in American life, though without question that exists. But we need to consider instead the possibility that the paradigm under which higher education operated in the United States has been failing and failing fast over the last several years. And if our institutions are to survive, we have to find a new way of articulating and living out the value of the university in the contemporary world. And this is true not least because the shift in public opinion they're reporting on here didn't just happen by itself, right? It was made to happen as part of a well-crafted program of discrediting and privatizing public services around the country. Now, from time to time, we are confronted with undeniable evidence that many of our institutions, and even those institutions that most profess their commitment to the public service, have utterly betrayed the trust that the public has placed in them. Which is to say that the decline in confidence in the university is not just caused by the public failing to understand the importance of what we do. It's also that we have in many ways failed, right? We have failed to make that importance clear. We've failed to protect our communities, both on campus and off. We failed to build institutions that are genuinely structurally capable of living out values that they profess. And so what I'm asking for in this talk is a tall order, right? In many ways, it's swimming against the current of the neoliberal institution. But a big part of what I'm after is really to press for new ways of understanding our institutions as communities, as well as being in interaction with communities, and asking us to take a closer look at the ways that we communicate both with one another and with a range of broader publics around and about our work. And focused thinking about that mode of public engagement is in order, I think, because our institutions are facing this series of crises that we simply can't solve on our own, right? We need our public's help as much or more as they need ours. And these crises don't always give the impression of approaching the kind or the degree of the highly volatile political, economic, and environmental situation that we've been living through over the last several years. But the decline in public support for higher education has always been of a piece with these other crises, right? Part of a series of transformations in national and international transformations in assumptions about the responsibility of governments for the public good. And I would include in that the very notion, in fact, that there can be such a thing as the public good. And the consequences of these transformations are indeed life and death in many cases. So this concept of generosity that I've been talking about for a while now may seem too kind of touchy-feely to represent the key to the future of the university. But I'm hoping that I've put together a case in the book for why this is not so, right? Why, in fact, the particular modes of generous thinking that I ask us to undertake within and around our institutions of higher education, in fact, have the potential to help us navigate some of the crises that we face at the present. I mean, many of our fields, after all, are already focused on pressing public issues, and many of us are already working in publicly engaged ways. But I think all of us within the academic community need to think about how we can generalize that engagement, right? How we might, if we were permitted to do so, transform the institution and all of the ways that we work within it, if that public engagement became the focus of what it is that we do. And that is to say, ultimately, that the best of what the university has to offer, what might matter most for the university in its relationship with the public, may lie less in its power to advance knowledge in any of its particular fields than in our ability to be a model and a support for generous thinking as a way of being in and with the world. Okay, but first, I need to unpack a little bit this we that I keep referring to. Who is this we? What is it that we do, and why does it matter? Much of what I wrote in Generous Thinking based on the university's permanent faculty, in large part because that's my community of practice, but partially because of the extent to which the work done by the faculty is the thing that we call higher education, right? Research and teaching are the primary purposes and visible outputs of our institutions. Moreover, the principles of shared governance under which our institutions operate, at least in theory, suggests that tenured and tenure-track faculty members have a significant responsibility for shaping the future of the institution. But I also want to acknowledge that it's important to be careful in deploying this kind of we. As Helen Small has pointed out, the first person plural is a rhetorical sleight of hand, she says, by which the concerns of the profession can be made to seem entirely congruent with those of the democratic polity as a whole. So while I hope that my argument has something important to say to folks who work on university campuses but aren't faculty, or who don't work on university campuses at all, but have some concern with those institutions, that connection of that we can't really be assumed. Right? If it would be great if we could make it possible for the we that I focus on here to refer to all of us on campus and off who want to strengthen both our systems of higher education and our ways of engaging with one another, and in order to help us all build stronger communities to ensure that all of us count in that process. But building that we is really the biggest part of the work that's ahead. We talk a lot on campus, after all, about community, right? About community engagement and about the institution itself as a community. We don't often talk about what it is we mean when we invoke that concept. So Miranda Joseph explores ways in which this idea of community gets mythologized or romanticized. And so the term ends up coming to serve what she calls a supplementary role with respect to capitalism, right? Sort of filling gaps and smoothing over flaws in ways that allow capital to function without real opposition. Additionally, in Joseph's argument, community in the singular, right, the community, runs the risk of becoming a kind of disciplinary force, right, a declaration of group identity that's designed to produce the us that inevitably suggests a them. So if we understand community instead as being multiple and diverse, right, as shifting entities that serve strategic purposes, we might instead be able to embrace community not as a declaration, but as an activity, right, a process, a practice of solidarity, of coalition building. It's a way of rethinking who counts, right, and adding others to our numbers and adding ourselves to theirs. This call for solidarity between the university and the communities outside its walls is part of higher education's recent history. I'm the subject of student-led calls for institutional change that spanned the 1960s and 1970s. But as Roderick Ferguson has detailed, these calls were met with deep resistance, right? Not just within the institution, in the governmental and corporate environment that oversaw it, led to many of the political shifts whose apotheosis we're living out today. In reaction, our institutions, rather than tearing down their walls and opening to the communities that surrounded them, instead they turned inward, right? They became self-protective. They looked away from the possibility of building solidarity with the publics that the university was meant to serve and focused their conversations internally. And so community in this strategic sense has been the university's weakness. It should have been its strength. So if we're going to save our institutions from the relentless economic and political forces that today threaten to undo them, we have to begin to understand university campuses as sites where new kinds of communities, new kinds of solidarities can and must be built. So, generous thinking. The book overall made the argument that rebuilding a relationship of trust between the university and the publics that it serves requires regrounding the institution in what I refer to as generous thinking, a mode of focusing its research and pedagogical practices around building community and solidarity, both on campus and across the campus borders. And this requires concerted effort to make clear that the real good of higher education is understood as social rather than individual, not in the credential, but in the community that gets built. Generous thinking asked us to consider how we work with one another on campus and how we connect our campuses to the publics around us. It began by understanding generosity as a mode of engagement that's really grounded in listening to one another and to the publics with whom we work, attempting to understand their concerns as deeply as possible before leaping forward to critiques and solutions. The book went on to explore the ways that critical reading practices that we engage in on campus might be opened up to foster greater engagement between scholars and other kinds of readers, creating means for those readers to see more of the ways that scholars work and the reasons for those methods, as well as for scholars to learn more about why general interest readers read the ways they do, thus building bridges between two communities that too often seem to speak past one another. And I also spent time thinking about the ways and the reasons that scholars might do more of their work in public, publishing in openly accessible venues and in more publicly accessible registers, and developing more community engaged research in order to bring the university's resources to bear in helping work through community concerns, as well as to transform those communities from passive recipients of the university's knowledge into active collaborators in shared projects. And this is all well and good, right? But if we're going to make these kinds of changes in the ways that scholars work, both on campus and off, the university as an institution must undergo some fairly radical transformation, right? Becoming the kind of institution that supports rather than dismisses, or in fact, sometimes actively punishes collaboration and community engagement. The university must become the kind of institution that can focus less on individual achievement and educating for individual leadership, and that instead focuses on building community and indeed on educating for community building. And this requires really a radical rethinking of reward structures of higher education, what it is we value, how we demonstrate that we value it. Our institutions are in many ways structured as collectives, right? In which Every member of the institution is charged with some part of the well-being of the whole. And this is how we derive our principles of shared governance, that we each have a contribution to make to the operation of the institution. Yet, right, when we stop and examine both the kinds of work for which we are actively rewarded, as well as the nature of the rewards themselves, we repeatedly find an emphasis on the individual rather than on the whole. So for instance, faculty at a research institution like this one, like the one that I work at, the work for which we are most rewarded is research, right, which we pointedly refer to as our own work. Right? I'm going to take this time off and I'm going to go do my own work. And the rewards that we receive for the success of our own work often pull us away from the collective, right? So if I publish a well-received book or an article in a prestigious journal, I might be eligible for a course release or from relief for service obligations, right? And all of the other possible rewards that I can seek, promotions and raises and sabbaticals and so forth, encourage me to retreat from membership in the university community and instead focus on my own work. And this is part and parcel of hyper-individualistic orientation of the contemporary university, in which every form of merit, right, including grades and honors and credits and degrees and rank and status and all of that, is determined by what I individually have done, even where I've done it collaboratively. Now, add to that the situation of most institutions of higher education today, in which austerity-based thinking leads us to understand that merit is always limited, right? And thus your success or distinction or your accomplishments can only come at my expense, right? And the result is that we find ourselves in a zero-sum game in which we have to compete with one another for attention, for acclaim, for resources, for time, right? We're all trapped on this quest for what Thorstein Veblen referred to as invidious distinction, in which we separate ourselves from everyone by climbing over one another. Well, it's important to note that this situation applies as much to institutions as it does to the individuals who work in them. Right? So budget models such as responsibility center management promote competition among academic units for majors and enrollments, actively discourage any attempts to think across units, whether to develop new interdisciplinary collaborations or support connections and resource sharing across larger university structures. And insofar as these sorts of budgetary structures within our institutions drive us all toward competition, our institutions as a whole are similarly under a mandate, as Chris Newfield has said, to compete all the time, right? Seeking to distinguish themselves from other institutions by promoting their own interests. We need our institutions to find ways to distance themselves from the rankings and the other quantified metrics for excellence that pit them against one another, in order for those institutions to promote more generous, more collaborative internal structures, as well as a work environment in which each of us who work for them can move fully away from the competitive thinking that we're also ingrained in and into a mode that is more collective. And this is no easy task. During the years just before and after Generous Thinking was published, I had the opportunity to speak on a number of college and university campuses where faculty, staff, students, and administrators were all thinking about how to create and support a greater sense of connection in their campus communities and their public-facing mission. And the folks who invited me to talk, ranging from the officers of campus AAP chapters to university presidents and their advisors, felt a connection with the arguments that I was making, not least because they recognized that their institutions required not just better strategic plans, but real culture change. And that culture change demands, among other things, a serious rethinking of how we work, why we work the ways we do, how we assess and reward that work, how we recognize as work the kinds of things that tend to get dismissed as service, right? But actually play a really crucial role in building and sustaining collaborative communities. Generous Thinking, however, focused pretty tightly on the why and the what of the changes that our university cultures need to make, and spent a whole lot less time on how, right? For instance, I mean, it's clear that making a better, more sustainable institution might require us to move away from the individualistic ideas of meritorious production that I described earlier, right? In fact, to perhaps step off the Fordist production line entirely, the line that asks us always to do more. And instead, for all of us to think in a humane fashion about ways that we might do better, right? Better often requires slowing down, right? It requires talking with our colleagues and our communities, and most importantly, listening to what others have to say. Better requires engagement and connection and sharing and time in ways that more nearly always encourages us to rush past. So turning from more to better can help us access the pleasures and maybe even the joys of our work that life on the production line has required us to push aside. But given the ways that our institutional lives are so deeply steeped in more, it's not at all clear how we might begin to slow down, right? How we might begin to make a set of changes that go against the ingrained ways of working that have come to seem so natural to us. So I was already starting to think that I needed to follow up generous thinking with something that would dig a little bit further into the how of transformation. And then after one of the talks that I gave, an attendee asked me a question that sort of made the stakes of thinking about how painfully clear. And her question got stuck in my head during the early days of the pandemic in particular. She said, generosity is all well and good. Right. And it's something that it's relatively easy to embrace when resources are plentiful. How do we practice generosity in hard times? Right? Can we afford to think generously when we're facing significant budget cuts, for instance? Or is it inevitable that we all fall back into analytics-driven competition with every unit, much less every worker, out to protect their own resources and privileges? I don't remember how I answered at that moment. I suspect it was some combination of, like, you're completely right, is the real question, and pointing out that the difficulties involved in being generous in hard times are precisely why we need to practice generosity in a determined way in good times. And I might have said some things about the importance of transparency and priority setting and decision making and of involving the collective in the process. But I do know that whatever it was I said, I was standing there thinking, oh God, this is hard. I don't know. I don't know how we maintain the wherewithal to be generous when times are bad, except by having practiced generosity enough to have developed some institutional and individual muscle memory, and by recommitting ourselves to our basic values again and again. And I especially don't know how we remain generous at the moment when our institutions are approaching us, right? We who work for them, as well as we who rely on them, invoking the notion of a shared sacrifice required to keep the institution running. I don't know, because I do want the institution to survive and I want to sustain the community that it enables. But I also know that the sacrifices that are being called for are never genuinely equitably distributed. And I also know, back to Tressie McMillan Cottom, however much I may want to keep the institution running, the institution is not thinking the same thing about me, right? Our institutions cannot love us back. However much we sacrifice for them, they will never sacrifice for us. And you alone cannot make the institution more humane, and especially not by killing yourself in the process. This is especially true for members of minoritized groups working within the academy. It's especially true for faculty without tenure. It's especially true for staff. And it's especially true for scholars working in contingent positions. It's especially true for everyone whose position in the hierarchies of prestige and comfort leave them vulnerable, especially at moments when we're all in it together is invoked not in the context of resource sharing, but of sacrifice. Sacrifice tends to roll downhill and it accelerates in the process. And this is how we wound up in the early days of the pandemic with furloughs and layoffs among contract faculty and staff at the same time as we found ourselves with a new associate vice president for shared sacrifice. The only way to prevent such sacrifice from rolling downhill is to build structures that channel it differently. And this was the deepest goal of generous thinking and has become the core goal of the follow-up project, which, as I mentioned a little while ago, I just turned in last week. So it will be coming in about a year. It's entitled Leading Generously. And in this project, I'm really focusing on how we can work collectively to build this more generous environment in which we can do our work together. What kinds of leadership are required for us to remake the institution into that institution that can be structurally capable of living up to its duty of care for all of its members in good times and bad. Leading Generously is in some ways intended to be a practical handbook for putting some of the ideas of generous thinking into action. But in doing so, it asks readers to reconsider some basic concepts that I believe underwrite big structural change. It proposes that despite the enormity of the transformation that higher education needs today, local changes can begin to make a difference, and that we are capable of making those local changes, which can network out into something larger. Among the concepts that demand reconsideration, however, is the very notion of leadership itself. I mean, we conventionally associate leadership with the folks at the top of the institutional hierarchy, right? Those who have the authority to steer the ship. And while I do hope that Leading Generously might have something to say to them, the project really addresses everyone on campus, beginning with the argument that everyone in an institution has the potential to lead it, to create local transformative change where they are, right? That can model ways of being that others might learn from and join in with. This conviction places a lot of emphasis on individual actors, though, in ways that might seem a bit at odds with some of today's most important ideas about how power operates. And those critical ideas, including arguments about race and racism, about sex, gender, and misogyny, about class and power, they tend to understand the issues that they explore to be systemic rather than individual, right? That is to say that they argue that real change requires social transformation, right? It requires building institutions and creating governments and enacting laws and transforming economies in ways that work toward equity rather than supporting privilege. And I'm 100% convinced by all of those arguments, and I have the same goal, right? Building those institutions that are structurally capable of supporting and facilitating the work of creating better communities and a better world. The institutions we have today aren't going to transform themselves, right? And the key problem is where we locate agency in these institutions. Who has the power to start the process of making significant change in the world? And if we understand power as residing in the structures and the systems that govern our lives, there's little agency left to the individual. It's unquestionably true that the structural problems that we face are enormous and that one individual can't do much to reshape the world, but groups of individuals can. And building those groups starts with individuals who decide to do more, right? Who put their individual agency to work in solidarity with others. And so Leading Generously sort of starts with you. It starts with from the position that each of us is on some level equipped to make change in the aspects of our institutions over which we have influence, however narrow those aspects may appear. And those changes can model new modes of being within our communities. But the second part to this question of agency, which is how to multiply it. So one of the deepest flaws in contemporary models of leadership is that our assumption that our reach becomes bigger as we climb the org chart, right? And of course, power does grow in that direction, don't get me wrong, but what also happens is that you narrow your connections until you find yourself at the pinnacle of the institution, right? You're at the center of power, but you're teetering there alone. As Sarah Buss notes in the introduction to a collection of essays called Radical Humility, which is quite wonderful, it's through connections, she notes, that we become larger, not through ego. And building those connections requires a willingness to step out of that central, singular position of power to work on coalition building instead. Right? We need those coalitions to transform an organization as complex as these. And we need to act in solidarity in order for those coalitions to succeed. And so, given this requirement, it's important to recognize that the object of leadership is not institutions, right, but people. Bringing them together and organizing for change. Building a more generous, deeper sense of us asks us to focus our attention on our relationships with our colleagues and with our broader communities, ensuring that we maintain the humanity, not just of those we work with and for, but of the structures which all of us connect. How we begin transforming our institutions then is shoring up the means of moving from you to us, right? The means of building those coalitions, collectives that are required to transform our institutions and make them capable of the kinds of community-oriented thinking that we most need today. Now, there are aspects of the transformation that I would love to see that really do require high-level administrative intervention. Developing the post-RCM budget model that rewards collaboration and contributions to the collective success of the institution rather than competition among units is perhaps first and foremost among them. And quite honestly, I believe that any institution that could successfully develop and implement such a model would become a shining example for institutions everywhere that are trying to figure out how to get out of that hole. But beyond these high-level administrative aspects of transformation, there are far more local aspects as well, aspects that each of your units can take on. Many of our units are governed by bylaws or other policy documents, and the things about those documents is that they can be revised, right? And it can be a messy process. But bringing together the members of a department to articulate their values and then rewrite their bylaws and their processes and their policies to align with those values can foster deep cultural change by looking hard at the discrepancy between, for instance, our desire for transparency and equity and our policies limiting who gets to participate in and vote on departmental processes. Right? Or by looking hard at the conflict between our desire for innovation and impact in scholarly work and our policies defining what counts as research in highly limited ways. None of this is easy, right? Not least because it requires us to do a lot of self-examination, both questioning the ways that our policies have become established and our own attachments to them. As an expert in organizational change has put it, people don't resist change. They resist being changed, which is, I think, a kind of biting distinction. We need to think hard about what these kinds of cultural change we'd like to see in our institutions will ask of us, right? We need to consider how we might become better listeners, right? How we might learn to sit with difficult conversations and even criticism, how we might commit to assessing our work and the work of those around us based on our deepest values, how we might cultivate an atmosphere of mutual and renewable trust, and so on. And each of these ideas, listening, vulnerability, values, trust, support, and more, all deceptively simple, but with careful consideration can become the foundation for a practice of community building, for thinking through institutional policies, processes, and ensuring that they serve the people for whom the institution operates. And the necessity of that practice is clear, right? Our institutions cannot survive crises that they currently face unless the people and the relationships that make up the institution thrive. Budgets and bottom lines matter, but without its people, the students, the staff, the faculty, the community, the university is nothing. And that's the thing that we need to understand now more than ever, I think, and the thing that all of the conversations that surround questions of the future of scholarly communication are ultimately working toward is the recognition that the primary work of the university is connection and communication. And that in hard times, the most generous thing that we can do is to connect with ourselves and everyone we work with so that we all might develop the collective strength necessary to rebuild. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. And I'm really glad to be here.
Well, we have a couple minutes for questions, I think. Yeah. Anyone, I don't see it online, so in the room, I can come around with the.
I find myself, it's just the day I've had, but I find myself moved by your presentation and I agree with many of the things you're articulating. And I just like to hear more about where you locate the incentive for this kind of significant cultural change. Because it seems to me that the people who have in an organization like any institution of higher education, the people who have most to gain from these sorts of structural changes are at most risk for being
Yes.
punished for
Yes.
collaborating or trying to motivate this change.
Absolutely.
And the people who have the most power to affect this change have it's hard to know where their incentive is located because they're the beneficiaries of the way things are currently set up.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah.
that's a sort of a question or.
It's, I mean, and I thank you for raising it. I don't know that I'm going to do an adequate job of providing like, oh, just tell them this and the incentive will all be solved, right? But I do think in particular that the senior tenured members of our faculty need to be willing to take a hard look at the extent to which all of the other folks that you mentioned, the folks who get punished for speaking out, the folks whose careers can be ended on a heartbeat, the folks who quite honestly don't have the privilege to say no to any request that the institution makes of them, that it's our clinging to the privileges of tenure that makes everybody else precarious, right? So what I'm after in leading generously in part is not at all an argument for doing away with tenure, right? In fact, it's the opposite. It's really saying that if as an institution, we believe that job security, it should be a basic right, that academic freedom is necessary, that the ability to speak out and have certain kinds of dignity and control in your workspace are required, we as senior faculty have to look at ourselves and say, we need to step out of the way and support others in their call for that kind of support from the institution, right? Okay. Here's where part of this comes from for me. My institution is mostly unionized. There is a non-tenure track faculty union. There's a grad student union. There are two different staff unions. The only people on campus who are not unionized, obviously the administration is not unionized. Tenure stream faculty are not unionized, and the clinical faculty are not unionized, right? This became an enormous problem during the pandemic when negotiations came about because of budget crisis to cut salaries. Everybody who's unionized was in a union bargaining situation. There's somebody at the table. There's a discussion about contracts and how this is going to go. The tenured and tenure track faculty and the clinical faculty had no representation. We were informed what percentage cut we were going to take. We then got used as a weapon against the unions because the bargainers went in from the administration's end and said, the faculty have agreed to take a 2.5% cut. You need to give us at least that. We hadn't agreed to anything, right? We were told that's what we were getting to take, or we were going to take. And so the idea that we have been used as a weapon against those with less power on campus is, it's vile to me. And it happens over and over again in ways that we don't see. We need to look at our responsibility in that. Okay, great. There's a unionization move on my campus right now. It is a union for the tenure stream faculty. The clinical faculty are now going to be the only folks on campus not unionized if the union passes. I am all for this union coming into being, and I am so dismayed that it creates yet another division in hiring practices across the campus, that there is yet another union coming in. The argument that I ultimately make in this book is one campus, one union, that we need to find ways to understand that everybody on campus, regardless of what it is they do, from the groundskeepers to the most senior faculty on campus, are all contributing to the academic mission with different job responsibilities. Therefore, we all have to support one another, right? How we get there is only by cultivating that sense of solidarity. It's not easy. Where's the incentive for those who are powerful on campus to give up that power? Maybe sort of putting our politics where our living conditions are. I don't know, but it needs to be there. And those of us who do recognize the need to be there in support and having the backs of the folks who are less powerful on campus to make sure that we aren't weapons, that we are indeed in their support. Sorry, that was a very long and rambling answer, and I don't know that I did a good job of it, but it is deeply felt.
Question: if generosity becomes a principle that the institution, how do we know when that happens? What looks different once we've used generosity as a principle for redesign of curriculum or labor relations or any part?
That is an awesome question, and thank you. This is a little bit more upbeat, and I can say some good things. So one of the ways that we know is that we'll never hear a junior faculty member saying, I have this really awesome project that I want to work on, but my senior advisors are telling me to wait until after tenure because I won't get tenure if I do this thing. Instead, senior advisors would be working with that faculty member to find out, why do you want to do this project? What's its impact? Why is this more important than writing 5 journal articles or publishing a book, right? We would have much more creative and exciting scholarship coming out of the institution because there would be support from it. Another way is that we would be working with our students directly to find out, like right now in the curriculum, in the ways that we structure it, particularly at the undergraduate level, we're the experts on that subject. So we design the curriculum and we figure out what the learning outcomes are. And we have like goals for what it is to be an English major and what every English major should know by the time they graduate. If we were really a generous community, we would be working with our students to find out what it is they want to know by the time they graduate and what it is they think they want to do with an English major, and then help bring them into the process of thinking about what the curriculum ought to look like in order to support their goals, because it should really be their goals, not ours, right? We would have graduate students who are not panicky and terrified all the time, because they would know that any career outcome post PhD is a good outcome, regardless of whether it's a research position or a full teaching position or going off into industry or whatever, right? We would be celebrating all of those successes instead of just reporting on our PhDs who go into tenure stream jobs. Right? There are so many ways in which the campus could become a much more joy-filled place if we were able to really embrace the needs of the folks who are in the process, right, rather than the needs of the folks who are established and the ideas that we have of what it is to be a success. Thank you.
I have Mike over here. Thank you. First of all, so many ideas resonate. It sounds to me at the heart of sort of taking apart generosity and it's taking apart expertise and turning it toward generosity is reorienting the framework of the institution toward learning.
Yes.
That part of, and I guess my question is, am I interpreting this correctly? Just to avoid the opening trapdoor from doing a comment rather than a question. That we're framing more, which is on expertise and production, toward better, which is how are you learning? How are you risking and learning and trying to figure out ways to measure the learning process and the experimentation process.
Yeah.
That demands humility as a point of entry.
Yes.
That you are learning with the student. You are learning side by side, in a horizontal structure.
Yeah.
That and it this is a side note that we learn through play from the very earliest, ages, and we stopped doing that. Probably because it feels really expensive, but I wonder if there are models from the massive pop culture world of collaborative gaming that could actually give a model for what you're envisioning.
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question. And I don't know. But I bet there are. There are really interesting models that should be looked at. The thing that was going through my head as you were sort of talking through the turn to learning and the humility that it requires. And so for Leading Generously, I read a lot of business books, a lot of management theory, a lot of sort of airport leadership guides and things like that. And there are many of them that are awful and that, say all the things that just have gotten us to all the trouble that we're in. And then there are some of them that are really breathtakingly smart and that that haven't been picked up in the ways that you would really like to see them picked up by our institutions and by the broader world that we live in. There's this one book in particular called Humble Inquiry that is about creating learning institutions. You would think that, the institutions that we work in could be characterized as learning institutions, but they're really, really not in the ways that the authors of this book are projecting. One of the things that they're talking about is that in their sense of the model of leadership they're putting forward, to be a leader requires deep humility, because it requires the leader to be the one who is asking questions and really genuinely listening to the answers, right? Like asking questions that you don't know the answer to and being willing to kind of learn from what you're being told. This is the kind of thing that we are terrible at by and large, and it would be really delightful if we could figure out how to embrace those modes of humble inquiry that allow us to kind of learn from everyone, right? The idea of play as being at the center of that is super smart, and I want to think about that. I haven't given it much thought.
All right, this is going to be our last question, so
no pressure. Kathleen, thank you so much. I think in many ways you remind us of what many of us sort of were drawn to and what we thought we would be doing in our careers. I'm struck though that in your opening frame, you sort of laid this moral imperative in the survival of our institutions. And what I don't hear in what you've said so far is that should we be able to do this, that this will actually fend off the assaults that the institution is currently under. And so, I mean, the kind of like glib way of saying this to you, but I think it'll help to sort of put a point on it, is will our institutions then survive, or will we just have more joy as the ship is sinking?
That is an awesome question too. I mean, quite honestly, I would take a little joy as the ship is going down. So I don't know, keep the violence playing. That's, but I'm thinking about last week and the announcement out of UNC that, you know, part of the new budget that's just been passed is a restriction of the concept of the distinguished professorship, right? New distinguished professorships on the UNC campus will only be created in STEM fields. Those non-STEM fields that have distinguished professorships, they can keep them for now, right? But to be distinguished, you have to be in STEM. And there is immediately after this announcement on the various social media networks, folks who are ostensibly in our humanities fields who are popping up and saying, you know, this is kind of what we get, you know, for being so critical and for being so ideological. Did we think it wasn't going to come back and bite us that, you know, we've been doing all of this radical work and now they're, of course, shutting us down. And there's a part of me that gets where that response is coming from and just wants to say, you know, no, the answer to these attacks is not to curl up in a ball and say, don't look at me. I'm, you know, I'm just going along, you know, I can support the capitalist economy with the best of them, but instead to sort of build the coalition that can help fight back against this. So here we are in Wisconsin. I am sadly going to go back to Scott Walker because why not? As Scott Walker is trying to get rid of tenure, is undermining the unions, is primed to destroy the University of Wisconsin system. The protests around the Capitol were incredibly moving, primarily for who showed up. Right? That it wasn't just the faculty, it wasn't just the university kind of showing up and saying, please, please, please don't do this to us. This is not nice. It was alumni, it was people who've benefited from extension programs, it was people from the state who showed up and said, this institution belongs to us, not you, and you can't do this. And it's the Wisconsin idea that made that sense of this institution belonging to us possible. So we need to figure out how to get the folks who could care about our institutions if they understood why they should, to help us at this particular kind of moment. You know, we watched, quite honestly, post Mapplethorpe, when the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities got attacked in the 80s, 90s, whenever that was, one of the prior instantiations of the culture wars. And, you know, budgets were slashed and all kinds of restrictions were placed on them. And those two agencies curled up in a little ball and said, just don't make trouble. I'm not gonna fight. I'm not gonna, you know, let's just be as mild-mannered and inoffensive as we possibly can. And we're now in a place where today an amendment comes out to the appropriations bill that zeroes out the budgets of the NEH and the NEA. So no amount of playing nice with these attacks is going to make them go away. We need to have that joy, but it's got to be a joy in the fight. I hope that's sort of got what you were getting at. Not really. It's not an answer. I don't know. I mean, you know, I am at an institution that is in, I'm still on Zoom, aren't I? Yes, I am. And this is being recorded. I'm going to say it anyway. I got tenure. I am at an institution that is in many ways a walking disaster. We have had 5 presidents in 7 years. We're looking for a football coach if anybody's looking for a job. I mean, there's just, it's one thing after another. And yet I work with people within the College of Arts and Letters who feel like we are on the cusp of doing something really amazing, because we've got a dean who has said, you know, values matter more than anything. And I'm bringing everybody together to work collaboratively around these values. I'm remaking the tenure process so that it's humane. I'm like, and the walls are falling and everything's on fire. And yet we're determined to do the best work that we can, because we working together are trying to make our local situation better, even where the wider world is falling apart. So.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. I feel like this is the room that really needed to hear this today. So thank you. And let's all tell. Thank
Thank you.